Good morning, folks. I came in and the clock wasn't working and it just set me completely bonkers because there's so much I want to do today that I really need to be watching that clock when we start. This is our last time together, truth be known, the more I was going over this, I used to teach a class on Judaism at Hastings College. That was a full semester class. And we're trying to squeeze a lot in here. But I just wish there were some things that we could talk about that we probably won't be able to talk about, but I want to touch on as many of those as possible. But today I want to start with what I'm calling a fateful coincidence. Today is the Jewish holiday of Purim. Jews have religious holidays like Passover and Yom Kippur, but they also have so-called historic holidays of commemorating events that ostensibly happened. This one particularly did not happen that we can tell, but it's a legendary story that's told, and it's a story of Esther. And we did, was it last fall or the fall before, when we did a series of programs on books that are not often read, and Esther was one of those books. You might know the story of Esther. It was written probably around the 4th or the 3rd century BCE, and it falls into that genre of literature that the book of Daniel falls into. And that is morality tales, right? How to be a good person in a dominant culture when you are a embattled minority community. And of course, you follow the law, you follow what God's covenant commands of you. Well, this story takes place during the time of the Medes and the Persians. The Medes and the Persians were the people that took over the Babylonians. And it was really the Persians that allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. And supported them while they rebuilt their temple, their second temple. But some Jews stayed in Babylon or stayed in that part of the world, and thus began what was known as the diaspora of the Jews. When the Babylonians destroyed the temple, some Babylonians went to Egypt, and when the call came back to, hey, we can go back to Jerusalem, some said, no, thank you, we're fine, we're doing quite well down here in Alexandria. Others stayed in Babylon, some returned to Jerusalem. So you can see the beginning of three trajectories, you might say, of Judaism. The Babylonian Jews would have their Talmud, reflection on the covenant. Those of Jerusalem would as well. And of course, there was a whole scholarly class that grew up around the Alexandrian Jews. So in this context, under the Medes and the Persians, under a king by the name of Ahasuerus, also known by Xerxes, two different names, for the same person. And the story goes, I'll be very brief with it. The story goes that Ahasuerus pretty much ditches his old queen because she was not respectful to him. And word goes out throughout all of the 27 regions that he's a king. That he wants to find the most beautiful woman to be king. And naturally, Esther shows up. Hadassah is her Jewish name. She shows up, and he is smitten with her, and she becomes the next queen. In the midst of this, the king has an advisor by the name of Haman, and Haman has a particular dislike for the Jewish people because it happens to be Esther's uncle, Mordecai. Whenever Haman, he was one of the great aristocrats of the time, whenever he would walk through the court, everybody would bow down to one knee except for Mordecai, who would stand there and he's like, I'm not going to do that. Recalling, the story of Daniel, who would not bow down to Nebuchadnezzar. And so Haman wants to eradicate the Jews from the lands of Ahasuerus. And the king kind of rather, in a disappointing way, just says, oh, sure, if that's what you want, you go do it. Until Esther steps in and says, do you happen to know that those are my people? that you want to destroy. Well, way leads on to way. We find out that Mordecai actually, Mordecai, Esther's uncle, uncovers a plot against the king's life. And the king tells Haman, the hater of the Jews, I want you to go find that guy, and I want you to, I want to give him great honors. Well, he does that, and Esther basically says, because my uncle has done this, and because you have granted me whatever I wanted, I want you not to kill the Jews, and I want you to take out that revenge on Mordecai and his 4 sons. So that happens. And so it's this time of year that Purim is the festival in which this whole scene is reenacted. They have little pastries, cookies called hamantashen, which are the 3-cornered hats that Haman wore. And, they tell the story, and it's like, it's kind of like, what do you call this? Vaudeville, where everybody boos and yay, that kind of thing. What is it called? Yeah, melodrama. It's like a melodrama. But what we don't know is the rest of the story. And this is why I call it a fateful coincidence, because after this is not where the story ends. The story ends at chapter 9. And I want to read that for you if I could. Now, on the 13th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 30th day, when the king's command and an edict were about to be executed, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain power over them, which had been changed to a day when the Jews would gain power over them. I'm gonna find my place here. The Jews would gain power over the foes. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who had sought their ruin, and no one could withstand them, because the fear of them, the Jews, of the fallen peoples, all the officials of the provinces, the satraps and so on, feared the Jews and were supporting the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. For Mordecai was powerful in the king's house, and the fame spread throughout all the provinces as the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. So the Jews struck down all of their enemies with sword, slaughtering and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 people. They killed Pashaderia, Delphon, and all these other people, and the sons of Haman. And that very day, the number of these killed in the citadel of Susa reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, in the citadel of Susa, the Jews have killed 500 people. And so the 10 sons of Haman, what have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. So, that's not enough. 500 people. And Esther, just so I don't, continue to read on, Esther says, well, we want to kill everybody who dislikes the Jews in the kingdom. And they do, and the number grows to about 10,000. That story is never told, right? But the whole story, it finds its culmination in a kind of what would we say, a feeling of justification for turning the tables. Here, the embattled, persecuted Jews finally get their wish. And what do? They turn the tables. And there's a place in there where it says they killed all these people, but they did not take any spoils of war, because that would be immoral, right? They did not take any of the spoils of war, as if replicating what was required of them in the book of Joshua, where God said, go and kill the Amalekites, but do not take anything from their cities. You just wipe those people out. Isn't it ironic? And isn't it a kind of a fateful coincidence that this one day, over a period of however many tens or hundreds of years, in this particular historical context in which we're living, Purim, which celebrates this victory, this violent victory of the Jews over their oppressors falls on the very same day as Palm Sunday. And by the end of the class, I'm hoping to be able to, put these two in juxtaposition. Because what it really boils down to is how are we going to be, quote unquote, saved? Is it by what we might call redemptive violence? This is the violence that is being carried out by the Jews against their oppressors. In the time of Esther, this never happened, of course. We can't find any historical indication this story ever took place, just like we can't see any historical indication of the book of Daniel that ever took place. But it was a story that was being told for a particular reason, right? That God still is with the Jews. God still is looking out after, the concerns of the Jews, and it will find its manifestation in the destruction of the enemies of the Jews. Well, Purim only goes up to the destruction of Haman. Haman, there's a lot of spikes with heads on them in Esther, and Haman and his sons, because they opposed the Jews, they get their heads stuck on pikes. But Purim doesn't go into chapter 9, where tens of thousands of people are being killed just simply on a whim, right? I think we want to kill more. And this brings us right to our present day, of course. And I wanted to mention last time when we were looking, a couple times ago, when we were looking at Leviticus, and we all know the commandment, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And we think, that's pretty much fair. If you hit him, he gets to hit you. But when that commandment was put in place, think about all of the, this would have been 3,000 years ago, all of the blood retribution that would have taken place in what we know of today as the Middle East, clan against clan, where somebody kills my brother and we go back and we kill 10 of his brothers and they come back and kill 100 of ours, and this fighting goes back and forth. Knowing how that escalation happens, right? Read again that commandment, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. What does it mean? No more than an eye for an eye, and no more than a tooth for a tooth. It's not saying go out and get retribution, but hey, don't let this, move on forever, which we know has happened in that particular part of the world right up to the very present. So, any questions about Esther and the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say?
So is Esther a real person? Do we know that?
Most likely not. Esther was just a legendary figure who was a moral exemplar held up to the Jews.
Was her husband a real person?
Ahasuerus, yes. Xerxes, yes.
Oh.
So during this would have been in the empire of the Medes and the Persians, would have been roughly 539 to 400 BCE. And most likely the story was written after this. There are these, like I say, these moral tales that are written and most likely orally transmitted during this so-called Second Temple period. Daniel, the book of Ruth, Esther. There is an extension of Daniel that's in the Apocrypha, which is the Roman Catholic Bible, which is not our Bible. I don't know if you know that, but the Roman Catholics have extra books in their Bible. But one is called Susanna and the Elders, Bel and the Dragon, all of these stories that are told to try to give exemplars that Jewish children and others can follow, to give them hope. Because as we've said, the Jews have always been, after David, have always been a people who have had overlords. They've never had their own autonomy in their own place. They're always having to pay tribute to somebody else. So it makes it very difficult. Now, just to remind you where these two trajectories have been, some have said, hey, God is going to make us our own overlords someday. This was during the Second Temple period. You just hold on, you just wait. We're going to have a king like David, and he's going to be this violent warrior king. and he's going to take over the rest of the world, and then peace will be established in the land. That's the idea of redemptive violence, right? That through violence, we can maintain peace. Philosophy we don't hear much of today, of course. I'm being facetious about that. Redemptive violence, through violence, we can maintain peace. But then there was this other trajectory, and this was one that Jesus would himself adopt, in that our identity as God's people is separate from and not dependent upon any type of geopolitical identity that we have. The way that we've been able to maintain ourselves through the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, right up to the time of Jesus, is by following the law, which is our identity. We live in a moral landscape, not in a geopolitical landscape. Therefore, the kingdom of God is one that transcends this, the kingdom of the world. And there's no reason why we can't carry out the commandments, carry out God's will for the world, separate from, but nevertheless within this world in which we're living. And naturally, that perspective would, couple 1700 years later, bring us to where we are, right? In terms of the Enlightenment idea that our founding fathers of the United States had, is that there should be a separation of church and state. One deals with the affairs of the state, the other deals with the spiritual affairs, and one should never take over the other. They should remain separate. At least that's how many of the founding fathers understood it. Now, there are some people who believe they got it wrong, that all the founding fathers were good Christians and they want to establish a Christian nation. And we have that conflict going on today. So any thoughts about Esther? Esther, go ahead, sorry. Somebody? Oh, I thought I heard somebody. Okay, let's talk now about the last time we got together. I showed you this map. And we got to the point where we were talking about the coming of Islam. Right here would be present day Jerusalem. And we talked about the building of the Dome of the Rock and the relationship between Christians, or I should say the relationships among Christians, Jews, and Muslims in the lands that were predominantly Islamic. And if you look at this map today, went all the way over here in the Indus River Valley, through present day Iran, the ancient or the Middle East, across the northern tier of Africa, Morocco, and then up into Spain. That was the extent of the Muslim empire. Around 1200, there were going to be a number of Frankish and Spanish compatriots who were going to push the Muslims out of Spain all the way down to, send them across the straits there to Morocco. And they would claim Spain for its as a Christian land for them, which makes Spain just an incredibly interesting place to visit. I'm hoping to get there someday because most of the architecture that still remains is architecture that has a lot of that similarity to what we saw in the Dome of the Rock. A lot of these mosaics. Here's the Dome of the Rock. Byzantine, in other words, kind of short and squat, but nevertheless having a lot of embellishments. And you can see in that distance, that writing along the top of the mosaic there that, this is passages from the Quran. And of course, in Islam, you cannot represent any type of individual human lest it become an idol. So what they do is they have these highly stylized patterned forms of architecture or art that are embellishments of the architecture. And it's meant to be a reflection of the complexity and the rational balance that God has in creating the world. So that's where we were last time. And here is that map. Today I'd like to talk about what happens in this area up here. And I'm going to show you another map because this is where the Jews are going to develop in a predominantly Christian environment. There are two types of Judaism. You wouldn't want to call them denominations, but Jews who developed, whose history can be traced back to the Muslim lands in which they lived, are called Sephardic Jews. And those who developed in, the Christian lands are called Ashkenazic Jews. I always remember this by thinking about Ash Wednesday is a Christian holiday. So the Ashkenazic Jews are the ones who were able to live not as peaceably as the Sephardic Jews in the Islamic lands. And there are several reasons for this, and a lot of it has to do with just poor mythology, you might say. First of all, Jews could not own land when they lived in Europe. They were basically relegated to having, their small little communities. They were separated. They were mostly, peddlers, sellers of wares, cobblers, tailors, and things like that. They served the predominant community. And often, there was a very clear relationship between the dominant Christian community and the Jewish community, but they didn't own land. This gave them a lot of money, right? That they worked with. And one of the things they were able to do, I know you'll find this hard to believe, but lending money at interest is prohibited in the Bible. Did you know that? So you go tell your banker friends. Lending money at interest is prohibited in the Bible. It's called usury. Now, we have come to recognize usury as lending money at prohibitive interest rates, but 10%, that's okay. But the church very clearly said, no, we can't lend money at interest, because throughout Scripture, that was seen as one of the great sins connected with greed, that would essentially create a two-tier structure where those who had the money would keep getting more and more money, right? Because they would lend it. Basically, you're renting money to people. And that was something that the church nevertheless needed. They wanted to be able to build, especially in the 13th century, when after the Crusades happened in 1099 to about 1200 or so, they came back from Jerusalem, the Crusaders did, with all kinds of great ideas. And one of the things they came back with was the idea of using mathematics in architecture. Thus, we have the beginning of these great big so-called Gothic cathedrals. This is what I showed you. The Dome of the Rock is very Byzantine, right? Kind of short, squat, not a whole lot of light. But in this realm in which God is light, you want to build these huge structures with lots of lights. And up until this point, you couldn't do that because they just fall over. But if you start applying the mathematics that they learned from the Muslims in the Crusades, you can begin doing this. And people all over Europe want to create their great cathedrals. But how do we do it? We don't have the money. Call in the Jews, right? The Jews will lend you money, and the Jews will be the ones to basically fund that whole project. Now, the unfortunate irony of this is that oftentimes this happened in Lincoln Cathedral in England. The king would get his cathedral built, and then he would expel the Jews from the land. You guys get out of here. We don't want you here anymore. Never to pay the loan back, right? And this happened time and time again in Europe. And how was it justified? Well, it was justified by something called the blood libel. Has anybody ever heard of this? It's a terrible, but it was used all the time. The Jews, of course, were Christ killers, right? This is something we read about in the Gospel of John, that it's the Jews, not the Romans, who killed Jesus. And that has been the source of a lot of anti-Semitism throughout history. And because Jewish people lived in their own communities and were somewhat secretive about what they did, they had their own rituals, they had their own ceremonies, Purim, for example. These are things that weren't celebrated in the Christian year. You naturally become a little bit suspicious of who they are. And one of the stories that was told is that at Passover, in order for the Jews to make their matzah, this is really tragic, and I hope this doesn't destroy your Palm Sunday, was they needed the blood of a Christian child to make their matzah. They needed the blood of a Christian child to make their matzah. So whenever a child would go missing, or sometimes, children are always going missing, right? But for example, in this Lincoln Cathedral, there's a young child by the name of Hugh, little Hugh, 10 years old, who is believed to have been taken by the Jews and killed so that his blood could be used to make the matzah. And there's a little shrine to him in this cathedral. People would round up all the wagons, right? Get their torches and whatnot and go into the Jewish communities and just destroy them, right? And this really upset that relationship between that very tenuous relationship between the Christian dominant community and the Jewish, secondary community. So you can see how a story like Esther's story would be one that would be very, very hopeful for people living in that environment. There's a lot that we could talk about. There's one thing that I want to mention here that I didn't put. Around the 12th to the 13th century, Jewish scholars began to work in a philosophy that is collected in a book called the Kabbalah. And the Kabbalah really takes Greek numerology, that numbers have specific meanings, and applies it to the Hebrew language. There's a story that takes place in Prague, Czechoslovakia, where the Jewish community there, once again, an embattled community, they're being persecuted. And this one rabbi who studies the Kabbalah devises a way to create a monster who will save them from their persecution. And this monster is called the Golem. You've probably heard this before, or maybe you have. This, by the way, is for Mary Shelley got the idea for Frankenstein. So, like God in the beginning, the rabbi creates this great big 10-foot monster out of dust, and he places on his head the word truth. And in Hebrew, the word truth looks like this. This will show you the kind of numerology and mysticism that goes into the Hebrew letters, and it's still very popular today. Our friends here in town, the Hasidic Jews, grow out of a tradition in which the Kabbalah is very, very strong, very rich. So he places on the forehead of the monster this word emet, which means truth, and the monster comes alive. And he says, hey, go get me a bucket of water. Monster goes, gets a bucket of water. The Golem goes, gets a bucket of water. Go out and weed the garden. Very dutifully goes out and weeds the garden. But before you know it, the Golem starts to gain his own independence, right? I don't think I want to weed the garden. I don't think I want to protect you all at night when, the pogroms are going on. I think I want to go out and enjoy the world, right? So you see a recapitulation of the story of the Garden of Eden. Well, now the time comes where they have to destroy the monster. And the way to do that is to remove one of these letters from his forehead. So, and here's the Kabbalah. In the Hebrew language, this first letter of the alphabet is called an aleph. And it has no sound. It has, no pronunciation to it. It's just a silent letter. Therefore, it's a symbolic letter. and it represents God. These other letters, of course, have their own symbolism. But if you remove the letter Aleph from the golem's forehead, you have a word met. Do I know what met means? Death. So look at the mystical meaning of truth with the presence of God. Absent God, you have nothing but death. So there's this mystical aspect of the story itself, but there's also this, kind of moralistic aspect too. Don't meddle too much in the affairs of God by trying to create things that are beyond your power. You might also recognize that this is the source of the Disney, the Sorcerer's Apprentice, right? Where Mickey Mouse gets out there and is the apprentice's wand and has brooms and whatnot, fetching water for him before things just get overwhelming. Any comments about the Kabbalah?
Well, connection with Gollum
Yeah.
in Harry Potter,
Uh,
Gollum, I think.
oh, no, you're talking about, possibly.
Well,
You're talking about,
I hadn't thought of that until
Tolkien,
now.
right? You're talking about the Lord of the Rings, right?
Oh, Lord of the Rings, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know, I'd have to think about that one. Probably not a coincidence, because certainly Tolkien, being a medievalist, would have known this story. Any other questions about this? I find that very, very fascinating. Well, these pogroms and persecutions, of course, persist throughout Europe from 1000 all the way up to all the way up to the present, really. But I wanted to talk especially about a turning point in Judaism, and that was a philosophical movement that produced the nation that we are living in right now, called the Enlightenment. In contrast to monarchicalism, where you have a king who is divinely chosen, right? And you have an aristocratic feudal society, and all of the peasants down below really have to do what the king says. Of course, this was developing over time in Europe from the time of the Magna Carta. Hey, we have some rights too, Mr. King, and then finally you get up to the Enlightenment, where you have philosophers really begin with, Descartes, Immanuel Kant, John Locke. People are starting to talk about what it means to be human and what it means to live in a structure that is not recognizing your full humanity. Human beings are human by virtue of the fact that they have freedom, that we have free will, we have free choice. When we live under a feudal structure, that freedom, that free choice is terribly restricted. And it's all justified by, God says the king, and the Pope says the king can do whatever he wants, and you guys just have to deal with it. Well, by the 17th century, people are getting just completely fed up with that, right? And they started to think about what it means to organize yourself around a different structure in which and we should say here, all men have the ability to self-determination within certain agreed upon political structures. And thus you have the foundation of democracy as we know it. This is at the core of the French Revolution, this idea that all societies, especially the French society, no different than the other revolution was happening across the world there, across the ocean, should focus on liberty, equality, and fraternity, lest we use a highly genderized word, community, let's say, that all people together can govern themselves. That's where we get our representational democracy, and everybody can be a part of this, apart from kings separating us out into various structures. Equality, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Well, this was a great boon for the Jews, because there's nothing in this philosophy that says if you're a Jewish person, you can't be a contributing member of society, because A, you could You're created in the image of God. You have the ability to reason. And up until this point, there were many Jews that were starting to, become very, very important to European society, in terms of their money lending and in terms of their scholarly endeavors, music, for example, and in philosophy. And it was very clear that they had the ability to reason. So in France, the ideal was you Jews who have been, ostracized for so long, you can be part of our society. And so that presents a real problem for Jews because now we're at a crossroads, right? Which direction do we go? Do we go in the direction of remaining apart, entrenchment, you might say? Because we've been here before, right? In Babylon, we don't want to assimilate into the dominant culture. Then we lose our culture, right? But then there were others who were saying, no, there's a lot about this new culture that really reflects some of the values that we see in the covenant, in God's covenant, about care for all people, the widow and the orphan, the rights of all people, and equality, even though the word equality is not used necessarily in the covenant. And so there were some Jews that said, thank you very much, but I think I'm going to be part of this culture. And so you have, especially in the 19th century, the beginning of these various modes of being Jewish. You have, actually, really starts about the end of the 19th century, but you have one direction that is adopted by most Jews in the United States, and that is of being Reform. They call themselves Reformed Jews, living as members of society. There might be a Reformed Jew sitting in this room, you would never know, right? They don't wear the kippah, they don't wear any of the, the traditional clothing. Their worship service pretty much looks like the service that we're going to go to fairly soon here. They just simply worship God in a different way than the Christians do. But in every other aspect, they are members of this society. Then you have conservative Jews who pretty much look like us, except they're the ones that, still wear the kippah. They're going to be just a little bit more conservative. They're going to eat kosher. The Reformed Jews, give me a ham sandwich, I'm fine. I remember I went to school with a kid who was a Reformed Jew, and of course, at this time, I knew nothing about it, and I was just perplexed. And one day, he brought a ham sandwich for lunch, and I wanted that ham sandwich because it looked really good. I said, Mark Fields was his name. Mark, you're Jewish, you can't be eating that ham. And he said, well, I'm a Reformed Jew and I can do whatever I want. So I found out very, very confusing. But later on, I learned it was because of, this orientation that some Jews took during the time of the Enlightenment. Conservative Jews wanted to maintain some of their, they're kind of like halfway in and halfway out. We still want to eat kosher. We still want to worship on the Sabbath. In Hebrew, we still want to, maintain a lot of our traditional values, but we want to be in commerce with the world as well. So we will wear, our suits and we will be involved in business and, maybe join country clubs and things like that if they'll let us join, right? Then you have those who are going to be more entrenched, the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox. No, we're not going to do anything. We're going to follow God's covenant to the T. The ultra-Orthodox, these are the ones who will have the earlocks that were, in front of the Western Wailing Wall. And so you have a broad spectrum, and you even have a group of Jews called Reconstruction, who are atheists. An atheistic group of Jews, Reconstruction Jews, who simply want to follow their heritage and their ethnic identity, a lot of the rituals, a lot of the recognizing how important they were to their sense of identity. But after the Holocaust, they no longer believe in God, but they still want to affirm who they are as Jews. So you have atheistic Jews all the way to the other end of the spectrum to ultra-Orthodox. And this was the stone that was thrown into the still pond that rippled out into various ways of Jews being in the world. But I want to go back to this map and show you this section, if I can find it. Yeah, right around in, wait a minute. I gotta see where I am. Yeah, right around in here. Because through all of the various persecutions and pogroms, Jews were being sent east by the Europeans, you get out of our community, you kill our children to make your matzah, so they would go further and further east. And then in Russia, if you want to talk about anti-Semitism, Russia, especially under Catherine the Great, wanted all of the Jews out of Russia proper, and they sent them further and further west. So we have an area known as, eventually, the Pale of Settlement. This is, well, this would be present day Poland. Here's Germany, and here, of course, is Russia. This area we know as Ukraine, right? That Russia wants to take back for itself. But by the middle of the 19th century, a lot of Jews that over the centuries had been sent east by Europeans and sent west by the Russians ended up in this, we might really call it this Pale of Settlement, this bottleneck. And this is where we get a number of small little communities called shtetls, just groups of Jews living together and working together. Most of them Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, carrying out their own rituals, their own ceremonies from the past, following the covenant. And this is what this group represents here. You can see the old Jewish men in their black coats and the black hats and their long beards. Each of them being kind of the leader of, the rabbi being the leader of the small little shtetl. They spoke a language that was distinctive to them called Yiddish. Yiddish is a mixture of Aramaic and German. And we still use a lot of Yiddish words today, like, I can't think of one. Do they think of a Yiddish word? What is a kvetch? I'm gonna kvetch with somebody, feeling verklempt. There are a lot of common Yiddish words that we use, and obviously I can't remember one. What's that?
Oy vey.
Oy vey, yeah, oy vey, that's one, right, oh my gosh. Right, so these pictures represent various ways of being Jewish by the end of the 19th century. The shtetl, Baron von Rothschild, right, the richest, wealthiest man in the world, he was able to assimilate into Jewish culture in an aristocratic vein because of his sheer wealth. I mean, people needed him. But these are the ones that were being persecuted. And then you have this man by the name of Dreyfus, Alfred Dreyfus, who joined the French army, wanting to be a good Enlightenment Jew, joined the French army, was a French patriot all the way down the line. But then when there came to be a conflict, there came to be a scandal in which it became clear that somebody in the French army was delivering secrets to the German army, at that time, their mortal enemy. Well, way leads on to way, and before you know it, the most convenient scapegoat is going to be the Jewish soldier, right? And there was really absolutely no evidence against Dreyfus that he was the one who did this. But the old prejudices of the past came to bear, and he was stripped of his command and, court-martialed for treason. And this kind of sent the shot across the bow for most Jews. It's just like, yeah, this whole Enlightenment idea where we can be a part of culture, I don't think so. Because it's still going to come back to haunt us. Look at poor Alfred Dreyfus wasting away in prison. Wanted to be a good patriot, wanted to uphold the French ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But when the opportunity came and a scapegoat was needed, you fall back on your old, the old patterns there. So by the end of the 19th century, anti-Semitism was really, really rampant. And of course, in the midst of what would eventually be a very difficult economic time in the 20s and 30s, the old scapegoat comes to be called upon as well. The Jewish moneylenders, they're the ones who are the cause of all of our problems here. And I think particularly, anybody know who the most famous American businessman who was an anti-Semite? Do anybody know?
Ford,
Who's that?
Ford.
It's Henry Ford.
Hmm.
Henry Ford was the most virulent anti-Semite that you could possibly imagine. And this is a book that was just made up. It was fabricated, called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Have you ever heard of this? White supremacists today still hearken to this book and say, it's all laid down here about how the Jews are going to take over the world. And it was Henry Ford who really promoted this idea that the Jewish bankers were the ones who were in control of the world, and they were out to get us, and therefore we really needed to. He didn't call for their extermination, but he definitely called for putting restrictions on them. But it was terribly anti-Semitic. But if you hear about this book, even still today, it is a virulently anti-Semitic text. The foundational assumption is that the Jewish moneylenders are the ones who control everything. And I think that that's a common stereotype that you will hear from people today, right? But now to the beginning of the 20th century, I've got a little ahead of myself. You can see this Pale of Settlement where so many Jewish shtetls were established. This would be the place that would produce some of our more traditional standings of Judaism. As things started to heat up in Europe, many of the folks from these shtetls would come to the United States and would make great names for themselves. Actually, one of them, sorry, Colleen Adams not here because this, I think, was one of her favorite painters. Charles Chagall, if you know, Charles Chagall, Marc Chagall, I'm thinking France, Marc Chagall, a painter who left the shtetls early 20th century, came to France, but his early life in the shtetl came to be represented in his paintings. People like Isaac Bashevis Singer, who wrote Tevye the Dairyman, which later came to be known as the Fiddler on the Roof, the musical Fiddler on the Roof. But all of this harkens back to Jewish life, very idealized Jewish life in the shtetls. It was brutish, it was cold. In Poland and Ukraine, people were poor, people were just scraping by. But nevertheless, there was a sense of community there that people like Singer and Chagall idealized. The whole idea of enlightenment and the idea that people could identify themselves according to their geopolitical association, nationalism, because of the persecution that was happening to the Jews, and because eventually this area that we looked at would be the killing ground for the German Einsatzgruppen, who would come into these shtetls, basically have them go dig their own graves and then shoot them and they would fall. This is where the 6 million Jews who were killed in World War II mostly hailed from. And of course, it's pretty much devoid of Jews today. Not entirely, but fairly certain that there are not many people there that are Jewish. But the idea of nationalism, by the end of the 19th century, there was a guy by the name of Theodor Herzl who said, if Jews are really going to be Jews, we need to have our own nation. And Herzl, so in terms of nationalism, let's just define it. That is a group of people who have a sense of self-determination, usually associated with their culture, geography, their ethnicity, and their language. And of course, their laws based on human rights. That's the Enlightenment ideal of nationalism. There's other types of nationalism that we're beginning to see now called religious nationalism, where the laws are based upon whatever the religious text, relevant religious text is. But originally, nationalism was an enlightenment idea that focused on human rights, liberty, equality, and fraternity. And Theodore Herzl, by the end of the 19th century, was saying, this is what Jews need. We need a place where we can be Jewish. Now, ironically, Herzl was an atheist. And this makes perfect sense, right? Because religion only gets in the way of nationalism. And Herzl, like many very intellectual Jews, he came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, reasoned that if we're going to have our own state, we can't allow it to get muddled up in, all of these covenant ideals that have not served us very well in the past. So his understanding of nationalism is, let us have a completely secular state called Israel, and thus begins a movement called Zionism. Zionism, the idea that we can all go, and Herzl said, yeah, it could be Israel, the word Palestine at the time, but also Uganda is another place where we could go. They were looking at various places around the world where Jews could come and practice their sovereignty and self-determination in a democratic way. But this all gets caught up in very complex ways with the British Empire and also with some Christian ideals as to what Jews could be. And there were strong aristocratic voices in Britain who believed that, no, if the Jews are really going to be Jews, and if Christ is going to return the way that the Bible says he will, with the temple being rebuilt and things like that, then Jews really need to be have their homeland there in Palestine. The myth goes up that, well, this is just a desert region that nobody's living in. It will be simple as all get out for us to go down and establish the Jewish nation there. Well, that was a lie, because there were Palestinians that had been living there for many, many centuries, right? But the word goes out that, no, it's this like this barren region between the Turkish Empire of the Ottomans and Egypt. Along the way there on the Eastern Mediterranean, there's nothing. No, that's not true. By 1917, we talked a little bit about this. We have the Balfour Declaration that presents the idea of the support of a Jewish homeland in Israel. In 1948, that homeland is established. And in 1967, because of the Palestinians that were there, conflict was present right from the start. And the Jews have been winning. I should say the Israelis. I should be very clear about this. The nationalist identity is the identity you are an Israeli if you're living in Israel as a citizen. But in 1967, the Six-Day War, the Israelis took back more and more territory. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War, which is the third Arab-Israeli aggression, as it's referred to, and on down the line, all the way up to 1987, First Intifada, and when Palestinians are uprising, Israel has taken over more and more territory. This is the map that I showed you before. In 1946, Israel had not been, recognized by the United Nations just yet. This is what Palestine looked like. And these were small little settlements of Jews living in kibbutzes, who, had emigrated from places, some of them the Pale of Settlement, others from, Northern Africa, others from Europe, and had established themselves there. But 1947 and 1948, the UN puts forth this proposal and says, what we want to do is have Israel occupy this area that's white, and then Palestine, this is the so-called two-state solution. Palestinians can live in the green areas, and then of course the Israelis can live in the white areas. But shortly after that, from 1949 to 1967, right up to the present, there was nothing but conflict. And the Israelis won those conflicts really against all odds. You had Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and basically all of the Arab nations conspiring against them. And they were able to, in the 1967 Six-Day War, take back significant land from the Arabs, from Palestinians. So you can see this portion that's connected with the Sinai Peninsula was taken in 1967. Then by 2012, because the Israelis were starting to take more and more land, and because they wanted to invite more and more settlers, they started to move into the so-called West Bank and the Golan Heights and establish settlements of Jewish settlers there. And then what remains today, you can see this is all pockmarked with Jewish settlements. What remains today is this little strip called Gaza, where we know what's happening in Gaza. But it's the intent of the Israelis to wipe out as much of that green area as possible. And so the question becomes, and this is the one that is the most difficult one to answer. There are people who oppose this Zionist movement of occupying more and more land, justifying this by persecutions of 3,000 years that had preceded them. Like the book of Esther, we need to get rid of our enemies because they will only kill us. There are some people, mostly the kind of enlightenment-oriented folks who believe in human rights, who say this is not the way an enlightened nation should act. You had 1,200 people killed by people in Hamas. Now, your response to that is killing 30,000 or more Palestinians in Gaza. That creates a real problem. That's not how an enlightened nation should act. But there are others who are saying, hey, if you're anti-Zionist, if you are opposing Israel in their, in these acts, then you are an anti-Semite. You are opposing the Jews, right? And we're not going to solve this one here today, but there are a lot of folks who make very clear distinctions. And I will say that I will reveal, make myself vulnerable in saying that I am a person who makes a distinction between Zionism and Judaism. I don't think, based on everything we talked about in this class, Jews do not necessarily need to identify themselves according to a nation state. They have a right to do that, right? But it's not as if the nation state itself is the be all and end all of the identity of Judaism. So if I oppose the actions of the nation state, if I oppose Zionist aggression against Gaza, it's not like I'm opposing Judaism itself. But the two have come to be so melded together that it's difficult for us in any context to try to reason that out, because there are going to be people who have strong opinions on either side. And this is where we are. And I'm afraid I can't give you much direction in this. It is going to play itself out. But the irony, I would say, of Israeli nationalism is that, as Theodore Herzl would have said, we're a nation in which all people are equal and democracy prevails. Well, that's not what's happening in Israel. There are certainly second-class citizens in Israel, right? And so the religious nationalism of Israel has actually served to undermine the so-called rights of those people who are not Jewish, right? Not Israeli citizens, and who predominantly are Jewish. So that brings us our last minute to where we are today and our juxtaposition of ritual Purim, where the eradication of Israel's enemies is celebrated in very violent fashion, This idea that if you determine who your scapegoat is, if you eradicate them, all will be well. Violence will bring a certain kind of salvation. This is precisely what Jesus was trying to teach against. When Jesus comes into Jerusalem riding on a symbol of peace, the colt of an ass, he's coming in from the northern part of Jerusalem. And of course, people are laying down their palms saying, Hosanna, glory to God in the highest. What's happening at the southern end of Jerusalem is that you have the Roman legions, the Roman general on his white horse, and all of the legions with their shields and their spears coming in, representing violence, right? Representing peace through violence. It's the Passover. We're going to maintain the peace. If you step out of line, you're going to have to pay for it. Jesus, on the other hand, is like stepping through the looking glass, you know. The complete mirror opposite of that is that redemption will never come by violence, but only through peace. So I'm further along than I really need to be because we're almost ready to go. It's well after 10:15. But are there any questions about this? I wish I could have concluded with a little bit more discussion about this. Yeah.
If the way the Jews were persecuted in the 30s and the 40s, I mean, 3.5 million of them were killed.
Yeah.
My supply sergeant, Pat and I were stationed in Munich for 3.5 years.
Yeah.
My supply sergeant was in the 82nd Airborne and jumped on D-Day and fought in Market Garden. He ended up being captured and spent the rest of the war in Dachau. And
Yeah.
we go up to Dachau and to the concern in Dachau to investigate and and my supply sergeant spent the rest of the war burning bodies that the Germans killed in shower-like rooms.
Right.
And
so you can see the passion behind people who don't ever want that to happen again.
And I can understand the Jews wanting their state of Israel and they want to govern themselves. And I think that's all justified. I hope they kill every single Hamas people that came in and killed 1,200 of them.
Yeah, I know. And that's where a lot of people are. And I can understand that. It's just like the book of Esther. We want to be justified against those who have treated us so wrongly. It gives us a lot to think about here on Palm Sunday, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to conclude with just a brief prayer and then we'll go to worship. Gracious God, we are living in a world of violent conflict. We don't always know the path forward, but we know that through the help of your Spirit, we can be enlightened. We can be what we need to be, the presence of Christ to those in our community. We ask that you be with us now as we go to worship and throughout the week. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry I kept you a little late.
And thank you.